Hey everyone, I'm Steve from GamersNexus.net, and this is our Assassin's Creed Syndicate benchmark, which looks at the game across various graphics settings, including one of our own custom configurations that we used for most testing, and that was created specifically to ensure fairness between NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, and I'll explain why that methodology is important going forward. So, Assassin's Creed Syndicate is a particularly interesting game to benchmark, even if you're not going to play it. And that's because if we look at previous AC titles, Unity in particular, the game is one of the few games out there that will actually make use of the additional VRAM provided by some lower and mid-tier cards, including, as an easy example, the GTX 960, where you have 2GB and 4GB models available. In the case of Unity, we saw that there was actually a measurable impact between 2 and 4GB on the same GTX 960, outside of some changes because there were different brands, and you can watch the whole video on that if you're interested, but it made for a cool benchmarking title, and that's why we're back, along with other reasons like to see how the game looks and how it performs. So, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, some important things to know. This is a very GPU intensive title, and it's very geometrically complex. There's a lot of polys, but it's not overdoing it with poly count as some games do. There's definitely a lot of them, but the game does try to push fidelity through shadows and lighting as a very sort of less heavy-handed way to show the fidelity of the game, the higher graphics quality, without necessarily just flooding you with polygons. So that is something that AC is known for, really leveraging their shadows and lighting, which makes sense because at the end of the day, they are trying to appear at least somewhat like a stealthy game. So this game also is a GameWorks title, which means that it does include some of NVIDIA's proprietary technology, and these are things that we generally disable for testing between AMD and NVIDIA to ensure a level test platform. But to recap what's in there, because you will be hearing a lot about it this week and today especially, the main items are ShadowWorks, which includes PCSS, or percentage closer soft shadows, and that has a pretty big impact on performance on NVIDIA and AMD. And then there's temporal anti-aliasing is in there, which is not a ShadowWorks tech, but it is an anti-aliasing technology. And TXAA basically says, I'm going to do anti-aliasing. I'm going to take 2 or 4 taps per pixel, or 2 or 4x, as you may know it, and take those over multiple frames. So you're analyzing it over multiple frames, makes it a little bit less immediately intensive, and allows for the removal of some things like the marching pixels or marching ants effect that you get with shimmering and thin objects like grass, where it's tall and thin, and TXAA will help remove that, but it is ultimately an NVIDIA accelerated technology, so we disable it for most of our testing. The other tech in here, other than PCSS, is NVIDIA's HBAO and HBAO+, which is another form of ambient occlusion. The HB version of ambient occlusion is a little more aggressive. It creates a slightly more realistic look based on the light's position. So if I have the sun behind me and you pretend that wall is a window, the sun's shining through it, HBAO will have a pretty big impact on how that shows the shadows and the shading between connected surfaces within the game. But again, NVIDIA accelerated, so we disable it for most tests. The alternative is SSAO, and that's what we use. So to go over the settings for our benchmark, whenever you see or hear the word custom settings, or ultra custom as we've called it, that means one thing. It means we've gone to ultra high within Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and we've changed the anti-aliasing down to only FXAA for a couple of reasons, which I'll explain. We've changed shadows from PCSS to only high within the game, and then we've changed ambient occlusion to SSAO, and that's to create a perfectly level bench between AMD and NVIDIA. In our testing, we saw about a 20% performance hit from PCSS being enabled, so just PCSS versus high for shadows, and we saw close to a 36% hit with PCSS Ultra, which is a little bit more aggressive against the high shadow setting again. So pretty big performance disparity there, and you really shouldn't be using it unless you've got some high-powered GPU setup. With anti-aliasing, we saw another big hit with MSAA 2X plus FXAA versus just FXAA. The impact was about 24.7%, somewhere in that range, about 25% on average, and for that reason, we opted for only FXAA for almost all of our testing. Some tests, including the 1080p ultra high test, were conducted with the anti-aliasing MSAA option enabled. So you do have it there if you actually want to play with MSAA. And the big thing here is just the performance hit's so massive that we didn't want to present the game as unplayable because you're taking a 25% hit from anti-aliasing, which quite a few people can live without. But we tested both for those who want it. Let's get into the benchmarks here. If it hasn't already been shown in this video at this point, the 30-second benchmark course is available on our YouTube channel. It was rendered at 4K, but we downsampled it to 1080p 60 for YouTube purposes. And that's available if you want to see how we tested it and try and replicate our results. Starting at 4K, Assassin's Creed Syndicate is effectively unplayable at our tested settings. That doesn't mean it's unplayable period at 4K, but at our settings it is. At the time of testing, we were unable to get an SLI configuration functioning within Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I did use the brand new 359 drivers that at the time of testing were not available, and these are optimized for AC Syndicate. So we contacted NVIDIA, we're talking to them, and we're trying to figure out, hey, is this normal or is there something screwy going on our driver setup? I'll update on the website as soon as we hear back, but for now, SLI did not work, and we were unable to find a single GPU configuration that would adequately play Assassin's Creed Syndicate at our custom settings arrangement. Using lower graphics output, closer to medium, for example, or low, or medium, maybe a little bit of high, the 980 Ti would be a contender, but that sort of eliminates the point of high resolution gaming because now you're losing a lot of your fidelity, and the GPU just can't keep up with the load generated by AC Syndicate at 4K with ultra and custom settings, and it does struggle even at things like high or very high. So the 60 FPS metric is kind of just out of reach of our highest tier cards that we have in-house here. And as always, I don't currently have the Fury X. It was on loan when we first tested it, so I don't have one now. I'm sorry, but we're trying to get one. The 980 Ti, though, is a pretty good representation of where things fall. Moving down to 1440p shows things in a more playable light. The 980 Ti runs at about 66 FPS average with fairly strong 1% and 0.1% lows, and is what we would deem a playable card for these higher settings. The GTX 980 non-Ti holds on at about 57 FPS average, but could do with a slight settings tweak down toward high, for example, for maximized playability. Still, 57 FPS for Assassin's Creed is fairly acceptable, and since we're not dealing with competitive level frame rate demands, as in some FPS games, this is something that is really reasonable and I would settle on, though you will see bigger hits during major combat scenes and things like that that may dictate dropping to a high ultra hybrid setup. At 1440p, the brand new R9 380X pushes just under 40 FPS, falling shy of playability at 1440, but it is a $230 card, so you can't knock it too hard here. And this is with our custom settings, so again, dropping closer to medium will cut close, but then you're losing out on a lot of the fidelity, so it's really more of a 1080 performer looking at these charts. For something closer to playable, we look toward the GTX 980, the 980 Ti, and those are cards priced at $500 and $600 to $650 respectively. The R9 390X falls below 50 FPS, cutting it a bit close there, and it would play acceptably at a hybrid of medium and high settings, but again, you're really cutting it close depending on how close you need to be to 60 FPS to be satisfied as a gamer. That's really up to you to decide. Moving to 1080p with our ultra custom settings, the most flooded setting in terms of GPU population, by the way, there's a lot of cards on here. Everything from the GTX 960 4GB to the R9 380X and up, the new 380X, can play the game reasonably well. Sans a few occasional drops in frame rate during heavy load periods, but generally they play pretty well. The R9 380, which unfortunately we no longer have as it was on loan and had to be sent back, would land a couple percent below the 380X based on history of the other 7 or so games we tested the two on. And you'll see that in our 380X review separately. This would realistically plant the 380 closer to 50 FPS, though we can't validate that obviously as I don't have one, but based on knowledge and experience, that's about where it would land. As for cards that we do have, the 390X pushes over 60 FPS alongside the GTX 970 at 72 FPS, And the 980 and 980 Ti are bordering on overkill with these settings, so really not necessary to buy one of those. But at 1080p with ultra high, not our custom settings, the story is a bit different. Ultra high changes one thing. It changes the anti-aliasing from FXAA to 4-tap MSAA, and that hammers the settings, the performance delta, to the tune of about 20%. AMD suffers the most here, as AMD does tend to struggle with things like tessellation and anti-aliasing processing in particular. But if you really want anti-aliasing, if you need it at 1080, then this is why we tested it. This is what you need to look at. Generally, you're in the 980 territory for playing with anti-aliasing enabled. The most interesting data in the 1080p benchmarks is the GTX 960 performance, where we see the 16.3% performance disparity shown, favoring the 4GB card versus the 2GB card. This is pretty exciting to see, as only a few games truly make use of the additional 2GB of VRAM on cards like the 960 or the 380, where you have multiple SKUs available. And this 960, it can sometimes choke on its own core clock, which does limit the extent to which the extra VRAM can be utilized in some games. But Syndicate shows that there is a clear benefit, again, about 16%, 16%, for the 4GB card versus the 2GB card, and shows that there is a place in the market for both of them to exist. So then, the best cards for Assassin's Creed Syndicate, depending on the resolution you want, and assuming no anti-aliasing, you're looking at the GTX 970 and the R9 390X at 1080p with our custom settings. The 390X trails by about 7 FPS in our benchmarks, but it's still above 60, and it's a bit more affordable. It's closer to $300, sometimes $320. The 970, depending on where you're looking, is going to be on average $30 to maybe $60 more expensive than the 390X. But those are the two main options to look at for 1080p gaming with near max settings, basically. If you're willing to drop down to medium, still 1080p, just medium, then the cards to look at would be AMD's brand new R9 380X, which is $230. That can play just fine. And the existing GTX 960 from NVIDIA, we would recommend the 4GB model in this case, because again, pretty big difference between the two. But that's where I'd be looking for the medium-ish settings range. You can get some probably to high, but generally you're on a mix of medium settings, and that's putting you in the $200 to $250 range for a GPU. If you need 1440p gaming, the place to look is going to be something like a 980 Ti or a Fury X, which we don't have because it was on loan, we had to send it back. But one of those cards would put you in the range of 1440p gaming pretty reasonably. And if you need to get to 4K, it's really going to be a multi-GPU configuration. That's the only way to do it. And again, at time of our testing, SLI was not presently functional, so we couldn't validate that, at least not for us. It may work. I've asked NVIDIA what's going on. We'll see what they say. But for our tests, SLI was not working, and as soon as it is, we'll test and see where those two 980 Ti's fall, and if they can produce a playable frame rate for 4K at the ultra settings. So that is all for this video. If you like this type of coverage or any of our other coverage, of course, subscribe, check the channel, hit that Patreon link in the post-roll video. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel. The best thing you can do to support us is to watch the videos and to share them with your friends. So that's all for this one. I'll see you all next time.